Our first question is from a listener named Eli. I have relatives who were recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and the doctor said it's passed through genes. Can you expand on this? And do you have any suggestions on how I can prevent this personally?
I think the place to start, Eli, is that it's hard when a family member gets
Mm-hmm.
Alzheimer's and gets that diagnosis. It's again, a pretty scary diagnosis, and what can I do in this situation? I love the question that you're asking of, hey, am I at risk for this thing? And if so, what can I do to mitigate those risks? And I love that question, and honestly, it's part of my personal mission. Is one side of my family, the thought is that you get to a certain age and you get dementia, and then that progresses and you get Alzheimer's, and you end up passing because of these neurodegenerative types of conditions. And I always thought, like, that can't be it for all of us. Like, there has to be more to this. There has to be more things that we can do to prevent ourselves from getting these types of things. And when we look at the data, there is a lot showing that a lot can be done for this. And at the same time, like, people can do all the things that are quote unquote right, but still end up with a condition. And that's just kind of how it works. But the question of, is this passed down by genetics? I think genetics get so much credit
Mm-hmm.
because they're cool. It's fascinating. It sounds high tech. You can get all these genetic tests done now. There's a lot of money being made in um, genetic businesses. But again, if you talk to a genetic researcher versus a person that is making income off of genetics, you'll kind of get two different stories from it,
Mm-hmm.
that there's still a really long way to go. And what we can say from the research thus far is that genetics set the stage, but the environment will dictate what performance happens. So your family member has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Does that increase your risk of potentially having this when you're older? Yes. Is there a genetic factor that could play a role in that? We can't discredit that at this point. But what we do know is that even if you have a genetic predisposition to it, but you make the appropriate changes in your life for you as an individual, then your likelihood is really, really, really decreased, like almost completely mitigated. But we can't say that fully, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what can you do to potentially prevent Alzheimer's from being your future? And it gets down to what we have in the book of, it's simple but not easy solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing, you don't have to do anything like incredibly drastic. When we look at neurodegenerative diseases, what brings them on most of the time, when you look at their past patterns, is that genetics are blamed, but in reality, their sleep is pretty dumpy.
Mm-hmm.
They're not physically active through the day. Their internal load is incredibly high, and they don't have coping mechanisms for that internal load, right? Because you can have a high load, but if you have coping mechanisms, you're going to adapt, you're going to be fine. But when you don't have those coping mechanisms, that's when these things are going to start to pile up. So most things that we see with neural conditions, neurodegenerative conditions, it ends up being these plaques that are built up in the brain, and they're built up through time. And the tricky part is that once a person starts to show symptoms, it's usually pretty progressed in the disease process. So, we have to take control of these things before the symptoms start coming on. The reason sleep is such a big one is that when you're sleeping, your brain, your nervous system, as in your brain and your spinal cord, it does a car wash of cerebral spinal fluid and clears out all these plaques that you develop through the day, both from physical and emotional and all the, we'll just say, stressors. Your brain is working hard. There's byproducts that end up being there. The rest of our body has a lymphatic system that clears away the waste. Our brain does not have a lymphatic system. Our spinal cord doesn't have a lymphatic system. It uses cerebral spinal fluid to rush in there and clean out this stuff. So when does that happen? It happens during deeper stages of sleep. And most people are not getting to that as they get older, right? once they get to be about 40 years old, they have all these responsibilities, family, work, and I don't know, name the list keeps going on. Their sleep starts to suffer. They're caffeinating a ton throughout the day. They're not physically moving. They don't feel fulfilled. They've lost who they are as a person. All these things add up. And then eventually they get to be 50, 60, 70 years old. And these symptoms start to come on. Oh, these symptoms, this looks like it could be dementia. This looks like it could be Alzheimer's. Well, dang, we should have taken care of this long before. And that's really what we want to do with Hope Not Nope is, hey, there's a lot of things that we can do to kind of change the trajectory of the suffering that we go through. Like everyone will suffer, right? But there's a lot of things that we can be doing to change what could happen to us in the future. So it's a great question, and I feel for you and your family member that got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I've had multiple family members that have had that, and it's tough at times. It's, you know, they're breaking out of the nursing home and trying to go back and find their car. And you know, my great grandma and great grandfather, they'd break out, somehow get his car, and you know, they'd get caught like making out in their car and then have to get brought back in to the nursing home. So it's like these
Oh.
joyful things that were happening, but it's not joyful. Like there's glimpses of joy in it, but it's a hard, hard condition.
Mm-hmm.
So my heart's there with you guys. I, you know, have been through that with family members, and it's challenging.
Mm-hmm.
It's challenging, but I love the question of what can I do so that this is not my future. And the biggest thing is take care of your sleep, make sure that you're physically moving, that you're active, that if your internal load is high, that you have optimal coping strategies for you so that you're getting to these deep stages of sleep where your body, your brain is using the cerebral spinal fluid to clean out these plaques so that they don't keep developing over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing that came to my mind as you were sharing was the quote from the Global Leadership Summit this past year when they said, "Believe something new about yourself." And I think a lot of people, their relatives get diagnosed with this thing, or maybe they get diagnosed with this thing or whatever, and they believe that negative part, or they believe that diagnosis is the only option, or take whatever and fill it into the blank, right?
Yeah.
But the truth is, believe something new about yourself. Believe that you can be well. Believe that you can honor your mind. You can honor your body. You can honor the rest that it needs, and you can also honor with the movement that it needs. And all these things are so important. And so I think at the end of the day, just believe something new about yourself, and also allow yourself to become the best person that you can become. You're not stuck with these diagnoses. You're not stuck with the genes that you have, or what have you. You are able to have a high quality life for your entire life. And I think that that's the hope that we want to give you today and give our listeners today.
Yeah. And adding on to that, remember the destination. Remember where you want your future self to be,
Mm-hmm.
because it's easy to start taking sleep away when you're building a career, when you have kids, and like all these things are happening. It's easy to go, yeah, no, I can get by with 5 hours of sleep. I can get
Mm-hmm.
by with 5.5 hours of sleep. So you sacrifice and you do that and you do that and you do that and you're fine until you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And then when that time comes when you're not, right? Like, oh man, you got 20 years of sleep to now make up for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's awesome about our system and our bodies is that you can do that. But just because you can do that doesn't mean that you should
Mm-hmm.
do that, right? So protect your sleep. If you are sacrificing hours of sleep, make sure that it's definitely worth it. You know, in my opinion, that would be with a newborn baby,
Mm-hmm.
with kids. Like that's a great sacrifice to make for your kiddos. But if it's to go get that extra overtime hours when you're in a good spot and you don't really need to,
Mm-hmm.
if it's I'm going to stay out the bar another 2.5 hours when you could be at home getting ready to go to sleep. Like you have to understand that the sacrifices or the behavior that you're doing now will set up what's the play that's going to happen on that stage of genetics.
Mhm. And there's something to be said too, like there are times where you get 4 hours of sleep and then you have to do your entire next day,
Yeah.
and that just is what it is. You went to your favorite concert the night before, but the next day you have something important going on. At the end of the day, you're going to have moments where sleep is shorter, but don't get in the habit for the next 20 years of every single night you're getting
Yeah.
5 hours of sleep. We understand that there are certain circumstances. We understand that a newborn baby or even a toddler is not sleeping through the night, but hopefully you're not in that pattern for the next 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you have a kid every 2 years for the next 20 years, which could happen.
Right.
But
Right.
hopefully you can have a support system to help you in the midst of that as well.